Hi, my name is Gill. I'm the Salt Lake County District Attorney, and I also have the privilege of being the Salt Lake City Prosecutor through the interlocal agreement with Salt Lake City, so I get to be both. I was just most recently elected to my third term. I was originally elected in 2010 and just recently elected to my third term as a District Attorney. I got here like many other folks do. I was a little boy who was born in India. My father immigrated to the U.S. in 1969, and the rest of us, we as a family, came here in 1971. And he came to Utah because my uncle was here on a engineering scholarship, so that was the closest family that my father had. And so Utah became our home in 1971. For me, this idea of justice actually goes back a long ways. When I was a little boy growing up in India, my father had emigrated here, and we used to have this person I was living with my uncle, and we used to have this person who would come and help our household and the neighbor's house and help clean up, and I really liked him. He was this elderly guy. And one day there was this loud noise outside, and I remember sort of all of us going out into the street, and they had this poor guy because the neighbor's house, some jewelry had come up missing, and there were like 3 or 4 police officers who had dragged this poor guy out into the street, and they had these long bamboo sticks, and they were just wailing on him and beating him, and he was sort of curled up on a ball on the ground. And I remember talking to my uncle and asking him, I go, what's going on? What happened here? Why are they doing this? And he said, well, a crime's been committed, and they're trying to find the truth so they can hold somebody accountable. And I said, well, who are they doing this for? He goes, well, for the prosecutors, so they can find out, who's the wrong party and who's the offender. And as I watched this man, he was curled up, and I heard him sort of beg them to stop. I heard him sort of profess his innocence and then confess to everything, just only to find out about 2 or 3 months later that he really wasn't the criminal, that it was somebody else who had stolen this property. And that left such an indelible impression on me as a little boy that I never forgot it. And as I would come back and think about it, it always sort of reminded me about the responsibility of public institution, the use of power, and what it entailed and how it impacted a sense of community and justice. And so that never left me. And even later on, when I got involved in running for office and also doing the work of as prosecutor, I always sometimes say that the best political education I ever got was that I was born in a third world country, because I know what poverty feels like. I know what injustice does to the soul of a person, and what an unjust system does to the integrity of a community. So as I came forward in my education, I studied history and philosophy, and there was a natural progression for me there. I went from studying events to studying history of ideas to philosophy of language, and ultimately, how do you apply these principles? And the pragmatic application of that sort of was then nurtured by this memory that I had, and the law became this natural expression of taking ideas, applying them, and giving them value, and so the law school became that opportunity. And public prosecution specifically, because I believe in the inherent goodness of people, and I believe in the inherent goodness of institutions to be a positive impact in our community. And so sometimes I say it this way: if you want to talk about fairness and justice, be a defense attorney. If you actually want to do something about it, be a prosecutor, because I think it's the affirmative obligation that we have as public prosecutors to deliver on the promise of justice and fairness and equality in our system. So that was sort of my natural journey of how I ended up being a public prosecutor and then ultimately running for public office. So, when you think about a public prosecutor, the most simplest way to think is somebody does a crime in the community and somebody has to hold them accountable, and that sort of is that sort of TV version of what a public prosecutor is. But it's much more than that. You are an institutional representative. This is about the delivery of justice and fairness and equality, and ultimately the truth of our community through the expression of power through a public institution. So for me, it is about that affirmative opportunity to deliver on the promise of a constitutional republic. It is about the delivery of these ideals that we hold as a nation and that we say that we prize as a people. So it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to own that space and to actually affirmatively deliver that. So I think these public institutions, whether it's the district attorney's office or the city prosecutor's office, they are there as they're supposed to be accessible to our community. Because at the end of the day, this is not my office. This is really the community's office. And we're there in a service to that community. And I've always said that when crime happens, there are three injuries that occur. There is the victim who is for whom against the crime occurs, the offender who engages in that criminal activity, and the community in which that crime occurs. Justice really is the delivery of justice and fairness to all three and repairing all three injuries. And that really, to me, is what the role of a public prosecutor is. How do we deliver justice to a community of citizens for whom we work? They don't work for us, and how do we deliver that access to our to that public institution, which is their institution, not mine? So I believe in a notion called restorative justice. And what restorative justice is, that when crime happens, it causes injuries to victims, offenders, and the communities in which crime occurs. Justice, then, really is the repairing of all those three injuries. How do I become sensitive and support a victim of a crime? How do I get them resources and services and not recriminalize their experience or to re-victimize their experience, often in the context of domestic violence or violent offense and trauma that they've suffered, or as a result of a sexual assault. And then I have an offender who engages in criminal activity. And our notion of justice is based on a premise of rehabilitation and accountability. And our notion of fairness is based on the proportionality of punishment. So what is the just and proportionate punishment? How do I have that accountability? And then what are the mechanisms that we put in place, whether it be therapeutic or even punitive, to have that accountability, but ultimately they're going to re-enter back into society? And what is the mechanism by which we support that re-entrance once they pay their debt to society? And finally, our community in which these disturbances or these crises occur. What are our ideals? How do we value a principle of justice? And how do we deliver the promise of fairness and equality within the execution of that power and authority? So all three elements are implicated in that notion of restorative justice. And my role as a public prosecutor is to work and endeavor to find a measure of justice for all three impacted entities, not just one at the price of another. The most common misconception is that somehow public prosecutors are the bosses of the police. We're not. So for example, in Salt Lake County, I have roughly around 17 or 18 different law enforcement agencies that feed into my office. And each municipality, each mayor is responsible for their own police department. So we're not the bosses of police officers. And while we hold them accountable and we work in relationship with them in the prosecution of a case, I sometimes say I work with law enforcement. I don't work for law enforcement. I work for the citizens of Salt Lake County. The other thing is, I think people don't really understand that we have city prosecutors, we have county prosecutors, and we have attorney generals who are for the state. So a city prosecutor functions, their jurisdiction is just a municipality for low-level offenses. A county prosecutor prosecute serious offenses, but only in the county that they are elected in. And an attorney general is responsible theoretically for the entire state, and they do sometimes criminal prosecution. And then finally, we have our federal prosecution system, where we have federal prosecutors who are working for the United States government. So sometimes people will confuse those different roles and think that being a prosecutor means that you get to do everything, and you don't. our jurisdictions are limited in the roles that we get to play. And at the end of the day, we also just simply prosecute crime. Now, as a county attorney, most people don't realize that while I am responsible for prosecuting criminal behavior, I am also the in-house counsel for Salt Lake County government, which is a $1.4 billion corporation, and that we do all the civil work for them as well. So my clients are the mayor, every elected official, the sheriff, and also every agency in county government. So we're also responsible to defend and to actually do civil litigation on behalf of the county. So, for example, right now, my office is involved in the Big Pharma opioid epidemic lawsuit on behalf of Salt Lake County. We're also suing the state of Utah for an unjust tax policy that they've implemented. We also do everything from tax policy, land use, to environmental compliance, health department, you name it. And that's the other part of our job that most people don't realize that I'm also responsible for. Well, the DA's office has a tremendous impact in our community, not only in just the prosecution of a crime, but actually in a broader way. So, for example, we have a role to play with the amount of power that we have and how the exercise of that power impacts our criminal justice system as a whole. I can charge somebody with a crime, and I can alter their existence. And the collateral consequences of a prosecution can have intergenerational impact. So I have to recognize that if I'm part of a system, is it just, is it fair? And so in that sense, whether we believe in the fact that we have criminalized what are otherwise public health issues, drug addiction, mental illness, and the attitude that a DA brings to that in terms of therapeutic justice has a huge impact on how we're going to solve that problem for our community. I, as a DA, came out and supported Proposition 2, medical cannabis, because I didn't think it was fair for a prosecutor to be intervening between a physician and their client and a patient about what is medically best for them by criminalizing that medical choice. I absolutely believe that we have taken what is a public health issue, which is addiction and substance abuse disorder, and criminalized that out of either fear or out of other political issues, but this is the wrong realm where we should be engaged in that. It is the criminalization of the status of mentally ill people who are cycling through our criminal justice system. As a DA, I came out in full support of Medicaid expansion at 138% at the poverty level. And people said, why do you care? Because any time that any day if you and I walk down to the Salt Lake County Jail, about 60 to 65% of the people sitting at the jail right now would directly benefit from full Medicaid expansion in terms of the options that they would have for treatment and access to medical support services. And then we think about mass incarceration, racism in our criminal justice system, and who you are as a DA and how you're going to address that issue, whether we acknowledge institutional bias and unconscious bias in the decisions that we make. That has an impact on our community. Whether I can give access to our citizens, like I do every Friday, that any citizen can come up and meet with me because they have every right and should have access to this community. Further establish the relationship of what this institution does and who does it serve. So public prosecutors play and have played a historically large role, and we have a large role to play in the ongoing dialogue, because at the end of the day, here's my hypothesis over the last 24 years. I believe that when public policy makers fail to address the issue of social justice, economic justice, political justice, public health, education, and employment, those public policy deficits manifest themselves as crises in our community. And when those crises manifest themselves, we have relied upon law enforcement to be our crisis management. managers. And in application, they have disproportionately impacted communities of color and communities of poverty. And in the end of the prosecution, I am being asked by my community to reestablish stability through employment, education, housing, access to medical services, those very deficits which we failed to recognize up front. So in that sense, my office plays an incredible role, both in terms of identifying policies that are working and sometimes, more often, policies that have failed the promise of justice to our community. Sure. So what I mean by, I'm a huge advocate of therapeutic justice. And what I mean by that is that we have taken certain elements and criminalized which really belong in a different realm. So for example, substance abuse disorders, which were criminalized and felonized, really had a huge impact in the mass incarceration, which is now the descriptive reality of who we are as a nation. We jail more human beings in the United States of America than any other country in the world. And when you look at it, majority of those are substance abuse disorders. We also have criminalized the status of mental illness, and we have created a proliferation of cycling through the criminal justice system of those who are mentally ill. So therapeutic justice recognizes that we should be making decisions based on data and research rather than on emotion. So for example, somebody who has a substance abuse disorder, if you lock them up, which we will all pay for, their recidivism rate is in the high 70s. But if you actually give them access to treatment and address the underlying substance abuse, we can reduce that recidivism rate down to about 23-24%. By the same token, when you look at somebody who's mentally ill, who's cycling through the criminal justice system, their recidivism rate by simply incarceration is about 72-74%. But if you actually give them medication access and actually approach their mental illness as an illness by wrapping those services around, our data shows that we can reduce it somewhere down to 22-19%, and thereby reducing their incarceration, giving them a better sense of self-worth, and actually transitioning them back into society as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. So therapeutic justice really is about saying that there are other alternatives, and we should recognize that maybe when we have criminalized this behavior, we may have done so for other political reasons, and that really doesn't belong in the criminal justice system. We have tried to be innovative and supportive in different ways to approach this issue of criminal justice and how do we do reform. So our diversion program really looks at, for the first time, a data-driven, research-based. We're trying to gather information to see what are the barriers to our decisions that we make, but also recognizing that low-level offenders, if we're going to truly do criminal justice reform, we're going to be dealing with a system that is already in crisis. And while we're working to fix that system, and we continue to send people into it, then we're just trying to fix a dysfunction with people coming into it. So the idea of the diversion model is to actually go upstream to the front end of the equation, and by not letting them enter the criminal justice system in the first place. And if we can get a level of accountability and assistance to these individuals who are engaging in low-level crime, then we don't need to saddle them with the burden of actually entering into the criminal justice system. And if we can slow that flow, then we can still continue to focus on the reform efforts that we want. So it's a much more smart way to address criminal justice reform. So the idea of diversion is to take low-level offenders and not let them even enter the criminal justice system and be saddled with the collateral consequences. Mental health court is something that I'm very, very proud of. We're almost going on 18 years, and this was something that was very near and dear to me, because what we found out is that we had criminalized a status, a illness. For example, the largest mental health facility in the United States of America is the LA County Jail. The second largest, I believe, is Rikers Island. The third one is Cook County Jail. And depending on which study you look at, you go down to 14 or 15 before you actually get to a public publicly funded, publicly accessible mental health services, right? So it's this criminalization that was occurring. And we were cycling these individuals through without a return on investment. We were spending thousands and thousands of dollars and not really addressing the underlying core issue. It's about recognizing that mentally ill people don't wake up and say, let me see what crimes can I go out and commit today. Often the criminal activity is a consequence to their mental illness. So our theory was very simple. Rather than simply using the jail system and the criminal justice system to warehouse the mentally ill, what if we actually used it as an opportunity for intervention and wrapping services around the mentally ill and giving them the support services that they needed? And what we found out is that we could reduce their recidivism rates, we could increase the quality of their life, and in the process give them a sense of dignity and self-worth, which the criminal justice system was simply eroding away on a daily basis. So it's about respecting the integrity of the person before you and treating what is a medical issue as a medical issue. Now, in our system that we have, if they're engaging in criminal activity, they're held accountable for that. But at the same time, we wrap those services around and thereby actually giving them a greater opportunity to succeed proportionately to the issues that are bringing them in the criminal justice system. If you are a person who finds themselves in the criminal justice system, and you either are suffering from or have been diagnosed with an Axis 1 disorder, bipolar, schizophrenic, or schizoaffective disorder, and you find yourself in the criminal justice system, mental health court gives you an opportunity to reduce those charges and sometimes even not be convicted of them if you are willing to participate, and then actually wrapping those services around you so we can address the core issue with a continuity of services both while you're in the criminal justice system and how we help you integrate back into the community. So it's really about identifying and giving you that medical support and that medical intervention rather than simply having you be cycled through the criminal justice system. There are many things that it's been my privilege to be a part of, which I think that has contributed to at least trying to improve our criminal justice system. So, for example, starting in 2000, with the introduction of the idea of restorative justice, looking at data and research and therapeutic methodologies by which to address the issue of criminal justice system, that I'm very proud of starting that conversation almost 19 years ago. So everything from misdemeanor drug court to domestic violence court to DUI court to Passages, which was a restorative justice program, the Johns program, all of these different methodologies which focused on therapeutic justice. I'm very proud of the fact that we helped start the very first mental health court in the state of Utah, which now many other jurisdictions follow, which actually brought a sense of equity and fairness and proportionality to those who were mentally ill going through the criminal justice system. I'm very, very proud of our partnership with the YWCA to start the first ever Family Justice Center, which looked at victims of domestic violence, and rather than have them go all over the valley, bringing and co-locating services and wrapping those services around them in real time so they can deal with the most traumatic part of their lives. I'm very excited about our partnership of bringing the Children's Justice Center into our office and starting to start the dialogue on trauma-informed approaches and victim-centered approaches to victims of sexual assault, and how do we make better decisions and not re-victimize victims through this process. Very proud of our creation of our Veterans Court and the broader dialogue of therapeutic justice and criminal justice reform, our diversion program, something that most people may not realize. We also have an environmental task force, and we have actually gone out at the local level and done environmental crimes prosecution for the degradation of our environment, holding corporate partners accountable. We want them to be good corporate citizens, but when they violate those integrity of the environment, that we do the enforcement against them. And then, of course, starting the dialogue on officer-involved shootings that is impacting so many people in our criminal justice system, about making it much more transparent, publishing our reports, and making the calls as we see them, so we can better educate ourselves about and question whether the laws that we have are just and fair, or if we want different outcomes, what is our responsibility to change the statutory framework, but do it in an open, honest way. And then, of course, the broader issues of just furthering the conversation of eliminating racism within our criminal justice system, the institutional biases and unconscious biases that are part of that. So all of these different things and many more are things that I think that we are, in our way, pushing forward to have a better, just, informed and service-oriented criminal justice system that is accessible to all of our community. So I think that's just a start of the conversation. For example, we are leading in the country on a national conference on prosecution excellence and best practices. Last year we had 174 elected district attorneys from around the country who came here to start that very critical dialogue about what is justice, fairness, equality, and truth in the responsibility that we have. So one of the things I'm very, very proud of is that just recently we looked at convictions from 2015 to 1997. We looked at almost 100,000 cases, and from that we were able to eliminate cases that were violent crime, DUIs, domestic violence, or sex offenses, and we focused upon the core issue of drug-related prosecutions and convictions. And we recognized that those convictions, a conviction, a criminal record, is the modern-day equivalent of a scarlet letter that follows you around in a disproportionate way and has huge collateral and cascading impact even after you have paid your debt to society. It interferes in your ability to get a job. It interferes in your ability to get a house. It interferes in your ability to get an education or any kind of licensing in terms of any skilled labor that you may have. And those are just some of the barriers that are there. So we saw that as we start to become more educated about substance abuse disorders, that they should not continue to disproportionately impact people many years after they have paid their debt to society. So what we were able to identify from those 100,000 roughly cases that we looked at, that there were about 14,000 cases and about 12,500 individuals who would have benefited from a one-step or a two-step reduction to what they were convicted of, so they could actually be expedited towards the expungement process to have those convictions be removed off their name. And that was something that we did in an affirmative way because we know what barriers that they are. And for those 12,500 people, that was something they didn't have to hire an attorney, they didn't have to spend money that they didn't have, and they didn't have to carry the shame and the stigma of a prior conviction with them, which they've always carried as a millstone around their neck. And this was really an opportunity to say to them that the premise of our criminal justice system is rehabilitation and paying one's debt to society. And once you've done that, our responsibility is to welcome you back into a community of citizens, and that is where the delivery of justice really is. And so that's what we did, and we're very excited about that project. So our next expungement day is coming on November 1. And so the idea is very simple, that once you've had these one-step or two-step reductions, it can start the process. Last year, the legislature also passed the Clean Slate Bill, which recognizes that drug-related charges, that once those have been adjudicated, should move towards an automatic expungement under certain circumstances. So what we're trying to do now is that on expungement day, if you come down, we'll have prosecutors, we will have legal defenders, we'll have members from the community who will be there, who will be able to help you facilitate the paperwork that is necessary to actually move that process along. So the 12,000 cases that we worked upon, this helps them expedite that process to sort of actually be in a position to get their record expunged. And the reason why that's important is If you look at the study that was done for the Center for American Progress, I believe, that they talked about that 1 in 3 citizens have a prior conviction. And if 1 in 3 citizens have a prior conviction, and you cannot actually apply for a job without a background check, you can't apply for housing without a criminal review, you cannot get benefits if you have been convicted of certain crimes, what we're really doing is continuing to punish people for something that they have already paid their debt to society. But more importantly, we're removing economic opportunity from them, and then we're also actually creating the next generation of intergenerational poverty, of lost economic opportunity. So the impacts are huge, and the way we're going to deliver that justice is to have those records be expunged for those low-level offenses, and especially for those offenses which should have been public health issues rather than criminalization of that conduct. So that really is what Expungement Day is about. It's about giving people the opportunity to have a fresh start, which we all talk about, but we've been very poor at delivering to them. So there is a lot of good stuff that's going on, and there's still a lot to be done. But those are just some of the things that I'm very, very proud of. If you are arrested, you have lots of rights that sometimes people don't realize. You have a right to be silent, and that being silent cannot be used against you. You have a right to have legal counsel if you can't afford legal counsel. You have a right to face your accusers, to test the evidence that is being forwarded against you. And so you have a right to have that evidence be presented where you can question the people who are saying these things against you. You have a right to not have to say anything, and this is a burden that is imposed on the prosecution. You don't have to prove your innocence. Rather, the state has to prove your guilt, and you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. You also have rights to appeal, that if there's been a miscarriage of justice or a process has not been fair. So there's a whole host of rights that are there. And sometimes people don't realize that they have those rights, and they should, because nobody can compel you to say anything that you don't want to say. And the best sometimes right that you have is to exercise that right of silence and not say anything. As a victim of a crime, you have a right to be treated with respect. You have a right to be not re-victimized. You have a right to be informed of the process. You have a right to actually appear and engage in the process and be informed about it. And so those are rights that are there for you. And you have a right to make sure that this process moves along in an expedited way. You have a right to actually speak and be heard about what you feel and what the injury that you have. You have a right not to agree with the prosecution or the outcome of a case, and you have a right to directly address that issue to the court. You have a right to recover loss of monies that you have suffered as a result of the direct conduct, out-of-pocket expenses. And you have a right to seek out support and treatment through our crime victim support services that we have. So as a victim, you have a right to be heard. You have a right to be respected in that process, and you have a right to make sure that you can be informed and not be kept in the dark. So that is something that we try to do for all our victims, and victims need to know that they don't have to simply quietly, silently suffer through that process, and they have every right to ask for those services to be made available to them. So when I was elected as the Salt Lake County District Attorney, and even when I was the Salt Lake City Prosecutor, it was very important for me to tell our community that this institution, this office, belongs to them, not to me. I'm just a temporary caretaker. And one way that I started doing this almost 19 years ago, that any citizen on any Friday, when I have open time, can call in and come to meet with me. And I tell them, if they want to come in for a half an hour, yell at me, and be angry at me, that is their right. And it's my privilege to listen, because I want them to know that there should never be any kind of impediment or barrier, and they should have access to this institution, and they should have access directly to me, because at the end of the day, those are the people that I work for, that is the community that I serve, and they have every right to want to come in this office and share their concern and share their voice and ask questions from me. And that's something we've done for almost 19 years, and I would welcome anybody who wants to come down. And if you want to, you can go on our website at the Salt Lake County DA's office, or you can call 385-468-7600 and ask for Dina Stith and say, I want to have a meeting with Sim for my Citizens Day, and then we will make the next available time available to them so they can come and chat with me. Well, it was just something that I had written once that I've kind of kept with me, which is the ethics of the complacent are the virtues of the corrupt. And the reason I wrote that, and I've held it there, is because I think we have an affirmative responsibility. When we have the privilege of elected office, it is something we volunteer for. And when we get that privilege, then we shouldn't be complacent. We should speak truth to power. We have a moral obligation to affirmatively own that space, and we have a responsibility to serve the community and honor the trust of the people who have put us there. So that means we can't be complacent. And if we are complacent, then we're sort of contributing to the dysfunction of the status quo, and that really is the virtue of the corrupt. And so I look at it often as just a reminder of the privilege that I have and the responsibility that I have to serve my community. This newspaper, which was framed, was presented to me by the local imam at the Khadija Mosque. And that really captured, for example, the horrific act that happened there in New Zealand, that act of violence that was perpetuated by hate. And I was very touched because it was given to me as the context of my work, along with others, on getting hate crime legislation passed in the state of Utah. But most people may not realize that there's been a collaborative effort for the last 25 years to get meaningful hate crime legislation passed in the state of Utah. For the last 25 years, there has not been a single successful hate crime prosecution at the state level because we never had any kind of law that we as public prosecutors could rely upon. And so although the legislature went through sort of the process of creating something that they called hate crime statute, and they gave themselves little accolades and pats on the back, but it was a law that we could not use as public prosecutors. And the second thing was, it was also a law, even if you wanted to use, which we couldn't, it only applied to misdemeanor offenses, which were the lowest category of offenses rather than any kind of felonious conduct. So as a result, we as prosecutors never used that, and what ended up being is we had communities that were just not seen, not cared for, and they felt like it didn't matter to them. Because when hate crimes happen, they really have three victims. There is the person that you target because of your animus or hate and the injury that you perpetuate against them. That's the first victim. The second victim is the community that they belong to, and you send a chill of terror to that community. And then the third victim is all of us when this kind of conduct occurs and there's no accountability. So we agitated for the last 25 years to have something meaningful, and this last year was the first year when we actually created a law that allows me to enhance the offenses at the misdemeanor level, and when you engage in felony behavior, to actually use it as an aggravator to change the sentencing structure. And that became important because we wanted to be able to not only prosecute you for the underlying criminal behavior, but also proportionally hold you accountable for the hate element that was part of that. And for the first time, our community feels like that they're being seen, they're being heard, and as a result, that they matter as a community of citizens in our society. Because prior to that, we could not give them a measure of justice. So it was very important, very touching to me to receive that from our local Muslim community, but it was really a collaborative success of many voices that have been agitating for change for almost 25 years. As a person of color and as a minority immigrant, it was my privilege to be the first minority Salt Lake City prosecutor. It was my privilege to be the first Salt Lake County District Attorney elected as a minority. But more importantly also, I believe I was also the first Indian-born district attorney elected in the history of this country, and it happened here in Salt Lake County. And I think that's important because I'm very proud of my ethnic background and my immigrant story. But more importantly, it was very important for many other people of color and communities that are different and diverse for them to know that whatever office that they want, whatever office they aspire to, that you can have access to it. Because the color of your skin, your national origin, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation is not a bar to having the full privilege of being a member of our community. And that no power, no institution is shut to you. And it is important to be able to enter into these spaces and to be able to be that voice and have somebody who looks different. It was important to me when I was growing up to see people of color and diverse backgrounds in positions of power. I still remember when I was a student up at the University of Utah getting the news that Judge Tyrone Medley was appointed in 3rd District Court because he was the first African American who was appointed to the bench. And for many people like me, it was like, hey, there's somebody of color, somebody who's different, who brings that diversity, and that this avenue or this office, this position is accessible to that. I remember what it made me feel. And so if I get to play a small role in that for that next generation of diverse individuals who want to come up here and pursue whatever their dream is, then I think that's my privilege, and it's just part of a continuity that we have, because we don't have our individual success just by ourselves. Often it is on the shoulders and the work that others have done before us. I certainly was the recipient of that, and if in my little way I can contribute to that next generation of diverse individuals who want to come up here, then that's my privilege.